So what I'm talking about is City as Platform, and I'd like to present this as early ideas. So here's concepts and some theory around working toward some design principles. So a combination of what are some of the problems, how are we thinking through them, and then also what are some of the steps we're taking in terms of designing toward different outcomes. So the idea of a city as platform, and my collaborator on this project is Howard Goldcrand. What we're looking at, and Amsterdam is the first site, is an API for the city. And the API in this case is to think about how can we use our cities better. And there's a long history of activation, participation, and also celebration of cities. And for example, New York City subway systems back in the early 80s, where people were using a new code of graffiti to tell messages that literally were traversing a city. The train would go across, you're all city because it's going from Queens to Brooklyn, et cetera, et cetera. And often that language was about a disruptive language, a secret language, and what I'm marking here is kind of a poetic language. And perhaps it's nostalgia on my part, but I feel like we're reaching a moment when part of what's going on with the mobile media that we're carrying around with us is very often what's marked is, what can you buy? One of the things that our apps do best is tell us where can you get a good cup of coffee or where can you find the adapter that you need. And all that is helpful, but it's actually not enough if we're going to be leading these rich lives that are dynamic and are not about just better consumership. I think that's not me, for once. So the idea is, since we're at early days with pervasive computing and mobile pervasive computing, I feel like the task is to start now with working out how are we designing these systems better? How are we designing, first of all, for a higher level of participation? So the three bandwidths at which I think we need to be thinking and also that need to find a way to speak to each other. And some of this is technical design, but a lot of it is how we come in as participants. What's the role of agency here? Public. So what happens in public space? Is there indeed still public space? I mean, if you think about what it's like to move through a city, we have a lot of spaces that we cross through. The central station, is it public space or is it just a space that we're traversing? So where is the shared public space? And it doesn't have to be a kind of historical notion of the bourgeois public sphere, but how are we instantiating that now? Then a civic bandwidth, which is, in my mind, the local and the neighborhood. So facilitating and moving toward more projects of shared resources. And at this moment, with budget crises and all the rest, there's a lot of extra value in how do we help share better resources. It's not just on the side of it's better for the city, it's also better for the morale of community. And then the last one is the poetic, because for me personally, I don't actually want to live in a city where you don't have like spaces of secret languages, whether it's the tag on the wall that only you and your friend are going to follow. Well, in this case, now it's the hashtag that you and your friends are going to follow. So how are we creating more pipelines around that and using them? So something like this, augmented reality technologies, like this kind of AR visualization, which was from Sandra Vierkoff and the DOM plots, where you have essentially a flash mob, people coming and looking through their viewfinder, and they say, okay, I can see these figures, I see Batman, all the rest of it. This is a way of reorganizing public space and using these technologies to say we can do something of this moment that is in real time and a shared visualization. And there's a history of this with playing Pac-Man outside, ARGs, I'll talk about that a little bit more. And the thing that's important for me here is taking this culture of what had been historically virtual space and bringing it back into the world. What are the tools that we have to say we're augmenting the way that we're living now? And much of it is still very much playful. Much of it in terms of what I see in Amsterdam, what I see in the West, but then we can also contrast it with things that seem to have more immediate consequence if you look at events in Egypt or in other spaces where social media is being used to enact things in real public spaces. So asking, if we're designing for this city, for Amsterdam, for example, and we can play together in this way, are we also thinking about connections where other places where the play has real consequence? The Twitter becomes, we're going to sit in here. This is from Wikitude, and it's a visualization of the World Trade Center, and we just had this anniversary. And I show it because it's important to think about, well, how do you mark a monument? How do you talk about a history? How do you see things that's part of the story of a city that literally in this case is now missing? Also, how do you mark community? And I think that it's important to work with design principles that are flexible. If indeed the best way to communicate your message is to put it up on a piece of paper in the park and have people take a sticker off, then do it. It doesn't all have to be something like this. In fact, as much as we can manage to work where we're head up, we're more and more, we're designing things that we're seeing each other and seeing the world as opposed to, I mean, who hasn't had someone walk into them or almost bike into them because they were texting and doing whatever, and there's all this. So part of the initiative is how do you design for a heads-up city? And let's say we don't have our augmented reality glasses yet, so it's not going to be kind of this magic of technology, but a different kind of magic of the sensibility of how we're designing and how we're using. This is the Lost and Found kiosk at Vondel Park, which is, of course, fantastic for me because you get literally a space that's part of the design of the park where people can leave notes for each other. I lost this, I'm looking for my dog, and all the rest of it. Then we have something on the other side of it where you have the data feeds of a neighborhood, so the usage of power, the usage of water, that is literally then painted onto the street as a marker, a civic marker to those in the neighborhood. This is our information flow, and this is how we're visualizing it for each other. This is how we're manifesting it. I'm also calling on the history of the Derive, the history of the naked city, where you have Guy Debord wandering home drunkenly through Paris and saying, oh, here's the map of the city that I'm inventing as it comes along. We'll talk more about this tomorrow at my panel with Jeff and Howard and Lucy, but here we have a participant framing an actual image of a city and then the story, an augmented reality story that's happening within it. So these game structures of using real places, using real histories, but embedding in them new stories, secret stories, fictive stories. But some of, I think the conversation is, if we're augmenting reality in this way, where are we drawing the lines between the stories that we're kind of playing with each other and then the rest of the world, and then when are they bumping up against each other? Charles Stross writes about this in Halting State in his speculative fiction, this idea that in a pervasive network world, it's very hard to draw lines between the stories of invention and then the stories of what's supposed to be a hard reality. So this brings me to talk a little bit more about participation. Participation is often framed as who is writing an entry for Wikipedia, who's kind of the lead author and who's posting, who's tweeting. But I think that we need to also think about a more ambient participation if we're going to be designing for not just a small few who are the most active users, but then all the rest of us who are living in a city, who are sharing space. So that doesn't mean just make things easier, because often people say, okay, well, make it really, really easy to use. I actually think what you have to do is make it interesting. make it interesting for the individuals or for groups, for cohorts to join in a certain way. So one of the examples that I'd bring up quickly is an ARG that was for Showtime that Howard Goldcrand and I worked on, and some other people, where they took something that has an audience of like 50 million people and said, we take it, and you guys all know the structure of an augmented reality game where you create the game board across the city. We take these properties that you love, and then you come in, whether it's just figuring out a puzzle or whether you're actively on the ground chasing something around. You get all these different levels, different declensions of participation. And I think that's an important idea to keep in mind as we move forward. I'm not upset that it's for Showtime. You get an incredible user group because these people are really passionate in the same way that WoW users, you get passionate enclaves. But what I'm asking us is, how do we create these spaces of passion and passionate engagement, even if I'm saying participation can be modulated, outside of what is essentially entertainment properties or commerce? So let me just get to, these are some images from, here's a live site and then online things, and here's something from a newspaper. So taking it back to Amsterdam and this idea of how do we design for a better engagement of one city, and how can that engagement work for both somebody who lives here, this person who's having their 50th birthday, and you see the street is marked, you see all the signs of this is what it's like in a neighborhood. And then for those of us who come in as visitors in one frame or another, how do you read those channels? How do you see the stories and find the stories that are most interesting for you? Okay, so those are the ideas that I'm thinking about.